And on the panel, we have, for the third time, an incredible friend of the house. We learned so much from her, Miss Mona Eltahawy. And then we've got the Slay Queens. If you've been looking at the news, reading the news, looking on social media, you'd have heard about this book, Slay in Your Lane. Huh? This in Christ called the Bible for young women, old women, every woman, even the unborn ones. Just start, if you are pregnant, just start reading that Slay in Your Lane to your child. So I'm gonna just call them together because they're two people, but it's like they are one person as well because they did this book together. So I've got Elizabeth Uviebinene and Yomi Adegoke. A big round of applause.
You want them to sit together? Yes. Oh, sure. Yeah. All right. So let's swap our names. Yes, sure. There we go. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Energy, man. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Yeah. Do I still need to do introductions again? Yeah. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Wana. I'll be moderating this panel titled What Women Want. And we're looking at feminism and the ongoing fight against patriarchy. We have, of course, Mona Eltahawy, who is the author of Headscarves and Hymens. And official troublemaker as well. We also have Yomi Adegoke and Elizabeth Uviebinene. And they, of course, are the authors of Slay in Your Lane, the Black Girl Bible. So thank you guys for being here. I think the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that you both sort of come from different generations. You're speaking to a different group of women as well. You've been speaking to a different group of women. And I want to know, I mean, it's a cliched question because this is what the topic is. What do you think women want from the space that you've been in individually? So I'll start with Mona.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be back at Ake, and I demand that you all ask Lola to make me a lifetime member. First of all, I always begin with my declaration of faith, which is fuck the patriarchy. I'm also delighted to be with my wonderful sisters and comrades here, and thank you all for coming. So I have the great privilege, Wana, of moving between different spaces. So when I look at the various backgrounds that have made me who I am, I think specifically of Egypt, where I was born, Saudi Arabia, where I grew up in my teen years. I spent my childhood years in the UK, but they're a distant memory. And now the United States, where I mostly live. And I think, on the surface of it, when you look at those three countries, they seem to be quite different, but they're actually very, very similar. Because especially over the past few years, when I look at the United States, in this disaster called the fascist fuck Donald Trump, who's our president right now, and I think about the women who voted for Donald Trump. The day of the inauguration of Donald Trump, I wrote an essay for the Guardian newspaper in which I compared the women who support Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who's the fascist fuck in my country of birth, and Donald Trump. And while on the surface, again, they seem to be very different, they're very similar. And these are women that I call foot soldiers of the patriarchy. And these are women who, through their proximity to power and their agreement to be close to power, they accept the crumbs from power, the crumbs of patriarchy. And as I always say, I don't want the crumbs of patriarchy, I want the entire cake. I want to make my own cake. So I look at those women and I think it's the opposite of what those women have done that the women I know want. They want to be free of religious patriarchy. They want to be free of the kind of necessity of being close to the limited form of power that patriarchy gives them. And then when I introduce Saudi Arabia into it, it becomes especially urgent because since May, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, another fascist fuck. I'm going to be saying fascist fuck for the entire morning. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman began an unprecedented crackdown against feminists and women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia lives under what I call gender apartheid. South Africa used to have racial apartheid. Saudi Arabia has gender apartheid, and no one wants to talk about it. Everyone wants to talk about the murdered journalist who I know, and it was savage and brutal. But Saudi Arabia has been committing crimes against women for decades. So I'm thinking of the feminists in jail in Saudi Arabia. And what they want is to end something that is called the guardianship system, which for me encapsulates exactly the intersection between what women in Egypt and what women in the United States want, and that is to get rid of the patriarchy that insists it controls your life and is so much more visible in Saudi Arabia, because the guardianship system is the foundation of patriarchy. You need your male guardian's permission to travel, to get forms of surgery. So it's like patriarchy at its most obvious and ugly. So as we were talking earlier, Wana, I think the women that I know and the women that I've worked with the most want to work to dismantle patriarchy, of course, but in its kind of the biggest and most obvious manifestations of it. Very structural, obvious ways that patriarchy works to contain us.
Thank you very much, Mona. And Yomi and Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, I essentially agree with everything Mona said in terms of what women want. And I think it's important when we talk about what women want to look at what women want in terms of intersections of who they are and how that impacts what they want. Because obviously, me and Elizabeth, when we sort of were discussing writing this book, it came about because Elizabeth had read a lot of books written by essentially white middle-class women, sort of telling you that, you know, if you're more confident, if you're more forthright, if you put yourself out there a bit more, then you'll succeed. Essentially kind of looking at how white men succeed and trying to emulate that and being like, that's the key to, you know, thriving, and not just survival, but thriving. And then when she was reading these books, there was kind of like an elephant in the room, which was, what about when you're a black woman in a predominantly white space and you're doing that exact same behavior and embodying that kind of aggressive, forthright, confident way of, you know, putting yourself forward in the workplace, and it's interpreted as being angry. It's not as passion, but as being an angry black woman, as being aggressive, as having a chip on your shoulder. And that's when the sort of conversation about Stay in Your Lane came about, because it was very much, she rang me one day and after sort of like a trying week at work, and said, you know, can you, because I'm a journalist, can you essentially write this book that speaks to my experiences, not just as a black woman, but specifically a black British woman who's grown up in this, you know, country with all these kind of like unwritten rules about how to sort of get ahead, about what success looks like, and a country which pits blackness against what it is to be professional. So a lot of the codes of conduct that we have in work, in terms of how you dress, in terms of how you look, in terms of how you conduct yourself, are diametrically opposed to what it is to be black. So in order to have, you know, to look professional in the workplace, it's having hair that falls down rather than grows out. You know, going to work with an afro is something that means that, you know, you're making some sort of radical political statement. It means that, you know, you're the opposite of a professional person. And often, when we're trying to embody professionalism or we're trying to navigate the workplace, we're taught to sort of emulate the behaviors of white men. But then if we can't do that, as Mona said, talking about the crumbs of sort of like power, we try to emulate white women essentially in Britain. So I think that's essentially where it came from. And that's why when we talk about what women want, when we talk about women, I think so often in the conversation of what women want, at least especially in countries like the United States, in Britain, it's so much centered on what white women want. And that's what our conversation around feminism often looks like. What do white women want? Which is essentially often to take the place of white men, which means keeping all the power structures the same, keeping all the oppressive regimes exactly the same, doing nothing to emancipate black women's situation in predominantly white countries, keeping all those systems the same, but then being on par with white men. So yeah, I guess when we talk about what women want, it's, you know, obviously, as you mentioned before, freedom, equality, but it's about looking at, you know, how black women and women of color, women from different minority backgrounds are affected in that conversation of what we want, because we don't want to be, you know, equal. We don't want to be emulating what white men do, essentially, because that's just continuing that same oppressive and like destructive narrative. It's very much about, you know, as you use the analogy of the cake, it's very much about not just shaking the table, but breaking the table and building a completely new one, essentially.
Elizabeth, I wanted to kind of go based on what Yomi was talking about, and because you guys are also working, you know, you're dealing with women who are on various levels of oppression in terms of how it intersects. You're looking at class, you're looking at race. Sometimes you're also looking at like different identities in terms of a second generation of of young black women in the UK or first generation immigrants as well. And I want to know how that complicates, the inequalities that you guys are trying to, fight, so to speak.
Well, how it complicates. I think what we really wanted to do when we wrote this book was not to just, speak. We're from like South London to from a Nigerian household. So when we wrote this book, we didn't want to totally write it from that perspective. We wanted to make sure that we spoke to a range of women. So it was really important for us to have diversity within diversity in the range of the women that we kind of approached and we ended up interviewing. And in terms of age, in terms of, making sure that regional differences in the UK as well, to take that all into account. So I think because we took that approach, when we were hearing their stories and anecdotes and different advice, it wasn't so linear in terms of just like, this is the one-track approach to essentially thriving or in the workplace or, in health. I think we were able to kind of come at it in a way that was, had different layers to it. So I think in terms of, it does complicate it, but I think it depends on where you're starting from and how you approach it, because I think with a lot of the books that I was reading back then, I think, like Yomi said, there was an elephant in the room. So in terms of, making sure that if you're starting from a point where you're not acknowledging the different identities, then the outcome is always going to be the same thing, and you're always going to speak to the same person. So I think it was important for us, and I think that's what's, helped us to kind of capture the imagination of, in England, in terms of the different types of, people that have been able to kind of read this book, and even though it's very authentic to the Black British experience, they've been able to get something out of it. So I think it's all about where you start from, essentially.
Mona, there's for a lot of people who are sort of anti-feminists or people, mostly anti-feminists, there's always this thing of trying to homogenize feminism. It's supposed to look like this. You guys are all confused. You say you want this, you don't want this. You want that, you don't want that. And there's something you've always said, and you keep saying it on the internet every day: complicate women, complicate women. And I want you to explain what complicate women means.
Right. I especially say complicate women when it comes to Muslim women, because, I'm of Muslim descent, and as I said, I was born in Egypt and raised in many different places. And I think, this is where our conversations overlap so often, in that there isn't one way to be an Egyptian woman, there isn't one way to be a Muslim woman, but there are very, very narrow depictions of what being, especially a Muslim woman, is in the media and in popular culture and on TV, and the kind of Muslim woman that is allowed to exist. And so I move into spaces and I try to complicate them as much as possible personally by saying this is a Muslim woman. Red hair, tattoos, fascist fuck, all of this. But I also was a Muslim woman when I wore hijab for 9 years. But it took me 8 years to take off that hijab. And I tried, so my latest attempt at complicating Muslim women was earlier this year when I began #MosqueMeToo. Now, many of us know about Me Too, and we should always acknowledge that it began thanks to black feminist activist Tarana Burke in 2006. Now, this also goes to the heart of our conversation. Most people think Me Too, and there are so many celebrations of 1 year on, what has Me Too achieved? Me Too has been going on since 2006, but it's only been acknowledged as 1 year because of famous white actresses. So people only pay attention when white women speak. People only pay attention when white women are hurt. People only pay attention when it's powerful white men hurting white women. And I said that last year when we had RK. So in the middle of all of this, I heard earlier this year in February that a young Pakistani Muslim woman called Sabika Khan had posted on Facebook an entry or like an update on her wall. I don't even use Facebook anymore. I sound like the old woman that I am now. An entry on Facebook. She'd posted a Facebook status in which she said that she had been sexually assaulted in Mecca, doing, holy rituals. And, when I was 15 years old, my family moved to Saudi Arabia from the UK, and we went on Hajj. It was 3 weeks after we arrived in Saudi Arabia, and for the first time in my life ever, I wore what we call hijab. And during the pilgrimage, the fifth pillar of my religion, I was sexually assaulted twice in Mecca, in the holiest site for Muslims. It took me years to be able to talk about this. I couldn't, I was so ashamed, and what the fuck was I ashamed of? I had done nothing to be ashamed of. But this is like when a priest sexually abuses a child. It ruins the sanctity of the place, but the men who sexually assaulted me were utilizing the sanctity of the place and knowing that I would be quiet. So eventually, when I began to talk about it, an Egyptian Muslim woman said to me, and I'll never forget, she said, don't talk about this because it's going to make Muslims look bad. I was like, what the fuck? I'm not the one making Muslims look bad. It's the men who sexually assaulted me who are making Muslims look bad. So I began to talk about it in Arabic on Egyptian TV. And the first time I did that in 2013, the producer who invited me was almost sacked from his job because no one had said on Egyptian TV that I was sexually assaulted in Hajj. And then I wrote about it in my book, and then I wrote about it on Twitter to coincide with Hajj last year. So when Sabika Khan talked about it, I was like, are you fucking kidding me? It's still going on, and she got so much hate for it. So I began a thread on Twitter, and I said, let's talk about sexual assault in Muslim sacred spaces, and let's call it #MosqueMeToo to acknowledge Tarana Burke and to create, because the complication for Muslim women, and this is where my long-winded answer to your question comes, is that Muslim women on this side have racists and Islamophobes who want to demonize all Muslim men. And they want to use my words and say, you see, these perverted Muslim men. And on this side, I have the misogynist in my Muslim community who want to silence Muslim women and defend all Muslim men and say, shut up Muslim women like me, because you're just giving ammunition to them. And I say, fuck you to this side and fuck you to that side, not you guys, but the misogynist, I'm on your side. The misogynist, and you're not the racist Islamophobes. I love these women. So, and so Muslim women are caught between a rock and a hard place. And this is why it's so important to acknowledge Tarana Burke, because black women in the United States and black women in the UK and women who live as minorities and women from communities of color, we're always stuck between these two places where we have to defend our men who hurt us and we have to fight these guys. So who's fighting for us? Right. Who? Right? And the men on this side and the men on that side don't give a flying fuck about me. They fight over my body and they don't care about me. So I began MosqueMeToo to complicate it, so that, and the number of responses, it went viral. It's still going around the world now because we have to create these spaces for ourselves. So that when we talk about fantastical futures, this is what I want. Well, first of all, I want the utter destruction of patriarchy. Yes. Right? Completely blow it up to pieces. I want these two sides to leave us the fuck alone, and I want us to create spaces where we have these difficult conversations about our own bodies at our own pace and with our own stories.
How, before I move on to Yomi, how important is it that we be visible, you know, in sort of pushing, in sustaining our movements, and also in saying, you know, we're complicated and we're different, even within whatever group that we exist in? How important is it that we are visible?
Yeah, well, of course, you know, one of the things that...
Because you did mention, the, you know, the thing that it's only until once a white woman does it, then, you know, it's like there's a whole branding attached to it. Yes. But things have existed for time, and then people have no idea, and so their histories start from these white women as well.
Absolutely. So Tarana Burke in 2006, Anita Hill in 1991. And now, you know, white women in the United States watching Christine Blasey Ford, who, yes, was courageous. Hello, Anita Hill did this 27 years ago. And now you pay attention because a white woman says it. And I salute both of these women for their courage. When it comes to Muslim women, it's even more complicated. Because you've got someone who looks like me saying, hey, I'm a Muslim too. You've got my sister, my own sister and my own mother in hijab. You've got women in niqab. And I despise the niqab. I oppose it wholeheartedly. And I love my mother and my sister very much. We argue about this all the time. Complicate Muslim women. And there are some people, believe it or not, because I don't know how, who hate me because I fight against the hijab and veiling of all kinds. But I do it as a Muslim woman. I do it not as someone who wants to appease the right wing. Fuck them. I do it because I don't believe that patriarchy has a right to define modesty and humility and all of this shit that it always talks about. So, for Muslim women, it is our right to argue amongst ourselves. And that's my fight. So in the past, I used to talk openly in the newspapers I write about, yes, I want to ban the niqab because it disappears women, and women should not be disappeared. But I don't talk about it in those spaces anymore because it's even worse now because it's an opening for racists and Islamophobes who don't care about Muslim women. Now I say, unless you're a Muslim woman, shut the fuck up about the veil. This is our conversation. We lead this conversation. And I oppose the veil, but I oppose it as a Muslim woman.
Yomi? I want you to talk about, being visible as well, because I feel like that's what your work is, both of your book is doing. It's really documenting. You talk a lot about role models, and I think there was something you guys said where you said there was a research about how black people couldn't achieve certain things, and then you say for black women they're only shown in a small range, so people can't see the possibilities that are out there for them. And looking through the book, there are a lot of stories that you're sharing of these different women as well. And I feel for me it's in some way a sense of saying these people exist, possibilities exist. Someone who is a space engineer or something exists as well. And even right now, in sort of the space that you're in, there are a lot of young women in the UK, especially using the internet, to make themselves visible and bypassing like systemic structures as well. So how important is it that we, all of us in this room, make an effort to be visible in the work that we're doing?
I think it's completely crucial, and it was completely at the core of what this book is about. I wouldn't say it was easy. With this visibility has definitely come, I guess, a sense of sort of hyper-awareness and a kind of like weird, it's difficult as black women. Like, we're hyper-visible in predominantly white spaces anyway, and I think there's a conversation which talks a lot about the like paradox of black women being both highly visible and literally at the same time invisible, especially in predominantly white countries. So, an example would be in the workplace. If you are a black woman and you're, you make a mistake and you do something wrong, it's very easy for it to be like, oh, it was her. It was the black woman that made that mistake. She's the reason that this thing has gone wrong. There she is. We can all see her. We're all white men. There's the other. We know it was her. When a black woman does something right, that's when suddenly, the conversation will be like, oh, great group effort. The buck is to make about everybody did very well on this thing. The kind of positive attributes are never given to the black women. It's very much a thing that's where we suddenly become invisible. And in Britain, I guess the invisibility issue is something that affects black women sort of globally, essentially. But even in countries, honestly, where like everybody's black, it's still a thing where it's somehow in your. I remember, I think there was a conversation about a Brazilian, I think telenovela or something that was coming out, and they were saying it was the first one that had been produced. This was this year that had a predominantly black cast. And I've been to Brazil, heavy black population, and they're being whitewashed essentially in their own country. So I think which is very rare. If we ever talk about, what is it like to be a black woman, we're talking about African American women. So I think in Britain, we've very much defined ourselves sort of, when we've tried to look at, who represents us in the world visibly, like in media and stuff like that, we've always looked to America, as I think so much of the world does. And we've always kind of, rather than looking at our own, people that are blazing the trail in the UK, we're kind of like, what's Beyonce doing? What's Oprah Winfrey doing? What's Serena Williams doing? But we've had our own people that are doing their own thing in Britain, but it's very much been a thing where they've been invisibilized, not even by our own community intentionally, but you'll have a white woman doing the exact same thing as a black woman, equally successful. You'll hear the white woman's story told in every single newspaper for how many years. When she's black, you won't even know she exists. And that's why when it came to putting together the book and the advisory element of it, it was very important for us to speak to different types of women. As Elizabeth mentioned, diversity within diversity. We were like, okay, Serena Williams is absolutely amazing, but what about Lewis, who's winning Olympic winning athlete? What about, as you mentioned, Dr. Maggie Adarim-Pocock, who's a space scientist? What about our own musicians? What about the people that have blazed the trail here? And some of them were already quite visible. You had some musicians that, are household names in the but it was all about the women who weren't visible. So, the current publishing director at British Vogue, Vanessa Kingori, head back. important, not black person full stop in advertising in the UK. And we didn't know she was a black woman. Like, and it's a very a white woman occupied a position of such power, we'd have heard about this endlessly. So I think even make sure that we are aware, as you said, our histories don't begin with, you know, when a white woman decides that feminism is trendy and trending. Like, we've had our own resistance in our own communities for years and in different ways. And whilst with wearing the term feminist, they have how it's been coined. The came sometimes it's a millennial issue that we can honestly as well think that started with us, because you know people that have ever done activism, nobody came before us, so we felt it was really and did allow who had taken the diversity conversation to this point. I mean, in Britain, the way we like to call it, about the fact that so many writers of color are finally kind of like being been Black Girl season, and that's the thing. It's always been Black Girl season for Black women, and people have even asked us, like, what are you going to do when, you know, diversity dies down? Exactly. And we were saying, you know, Black women don't fall off the side of the planet just because white people in buildings decide, you know, at the top they decide, oh, we're bored of it. You know, if Black Panther 2 has sold now, let's go. Like, it's all, let's pack it up kind of thing. We were like, you know, these stories don't stop being valid. Like, Black women still matter, our stories still matter. These stories will always matter kind of thing. So it's not a thing where we should be waiting, I suppose, for, as you said, it's Black Girl season right now, but we're very much like, it will, you know, Elizabeth called me with the idea in 2015. Black Girl season it wasn't even something that we were even conceptualizing. It was something, Black Panther wasn't out, Hidden Figures wasn't out, none of these kind of conversations were happening. But the reason Elizabeth called me with that idea is because it was Black Girl season for us, and it always will be. We needed to have these kind of conversations. So when it comes to, like, if you see in Britain the way this book has been, like, sold, it's, like, selling really well, and you'll see literally, like, old white men on the tube with this hot pink book that says Black Girl Bible, because we were really intentional with that visibility. Like, we were like, something that I referred to as like a bookshop apartheid. Like, we have that in Britain, where it will say you have the whole of a bookshop and they'll have a shelf and it'll say Black Studies, and you'll have romance novels in there, you'll have Nelson Mandela's biography in there, you'll have work by Wole Soyinka in there, and then you'll have literally just the whole collection of things that have nothing in relation to each other other than the fact that authors are Black. And we were like, we refuse for our book to be in that section. We want this to be mainstream because our stories matter. And how can our presses even, how can we can't have these conversations in silos. We all know what the issues are. It's about, especially in somewhere like Britain where it's 90-something% white, we can sit here all day and talk about, you know, the fact that, you know, we already know what the issues are. It's very much about the fact that the people in power need to actually understand we're having these conversations, and because the way to affect change, especially in places like the workplace, in corporate settings, so many white women have said, I bought this book, and things that I genuinely I didn't see an issue with, things that I genuinely thought were just benign, like, you know, oh, you've changed your hair, can I touch, you know, that kind of rubbish. She was like, I didn't even realize that this was how ignorant I was being, and that visibility means that the fact that it's, you know, ended up in her lap because it's a book that's been so visible means that she has picked it up, read it, and started to understand the experience and make the correct steps to be able to change, you know, her own ignorance and essentially empower the Black women in her workplace.
British culture in itself, and that culture of like self-deprecation, and you don't, you know, put yourself out there, people are the ones supposed to praise you. Do you think that adds to this extra sort of oppression of Black women who, when they actually do achieve a certain status or when they're actually just supposed to, be able to be themselves or be unapologetic, they have to kind of hold that in. Do you think that has any role to play in it?
Yeah, I think women in general are like that, and I think British people are so much more like that. Being from a corporate background, for up until recently, it's very much the done thing, and it's very interesting when the male that's in the team, end of year performance reviews, they're very much more, out there, and they're very much, they claim, they will write down exactly what they did. They're very confident in their abilities, and they're very confident in telling people about that. For women, and especially black women, you're right, there is that case of, like, as Yomi mentioned, like, it's a team effort, like, there's definitely that self-deprecating aspect, absolutely. All those things that you are told actually contribute to the value of a workplace. But it's interesting that it's a lot of the time only women that do that, and men tend to, in my experience, tend to just do the whole, oh, it's me. Exactly. And then the outcome is women tend to not, I guess, shine as much, not because they're not doing the work, but they're doing it quietly, and they're doing it, and we talk about it in the book a lot, that we have wonderful advice in the book, and that was really important, because I think one of the things as well that I've realised, especially over the last year, is that, and especially meeting all these amazing black women that we've met that come to our events, different ages, is they are not looking, there's so much talent, it's opportunity, and it's someone essentially like spotting that and just going, okay, I'm going to help you. But a lot of the time, we do need allies that actually can help us on that journey. We can't do it alone. Like Yomi was speaking about in terms of being like sitting in the room and it's just black women talking about the same old issues. Our events are they tend to be like that, but very varied as well. We do get women that are that was done in America and in the UK, but it's the actual structure that we need more. And I think in terms of like in the workplace, showcasing that is something that we tried our best to do in the book, to kind of make sure that we empowered women to kind of do that. But it is definitely a thing where it's like you're more likely, even with like conversations with friends, you're more likely to just be like, oh yeah, like I really want to go for this, but I'm not sure. And it's that confidence that it was really important for us to kind of showcase that. And I think as well, it's a journey. It's not something that you just meant to just have and just go, oh yeah, I'm great now, and this is how I'm going to do it. And I think that was important for us when we do meet different types of women, to kind of say, don't beat yourself up for being not as confident as this white man, or not as confident as a white woman. Like, it does take time, because in school there is definitely that element of like shyness, and that element of not knowing your history, and that element of when they're talking about slavery, we're talking about black history, it's always like there's that, I don't know, lack of self-esteem that you have when you're 5 years old in school, and it carries on till when you're graduate, and does carry on when you're trying to get your first promotion, that it's important for us to overcome.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Mona, let's talk about sex.
Oh my God. Yes. My favorite subject.
I mean, our bodies are so politicized. Yes. And I would be very even specific with Africa. We've almost been seen as though, we're these very asexual human beings. Whilst, we all had our sexual rituals, whether it's Kuyanza in Rwanda, or, the Senga in Uganda, or the fattening room, or, northern Nigeria, and with Kayamata and so many things. We've always had sexual rituals. And so how is it that even we have become agents of these patriarchal systems that, asexualize us, desexualize us, and just want to like politicize our bodies only for the pleasure of others?
Right. I think it's absolutely essential to talk about sex, and it's absolutely essential to talk about it in the myriad ways that we can complicate it. They want to survive, and they realize the way to survive in a patriarchal world, and patriarchy is universal, is basically to continue to perpetuate the rules of patriarchy, and the more women police other women, the more those women are rewarded. And that's what we must destroy. We must destroy this idea that we are foot soldiers of the patriarchy. I am foot soldiers of no one. And I think we have to remind women as well, even in the conversations that we have when we talk about sexual violence. Like I said, Mosque Me Too, and when I talk about my own sexual assault, at the hands of Egyptian police, almost 7 years ago now, the conversation must not end with we have to help each other with recovering from sexual assault, we have to continue that conversation and talk about joy and pleasure and lust. And I think when we look at all the different cultural backgrounds that we come from, there are always examples of women who have been incredibly erotic, who have produced a lot of erotica, and who have enjoyed and shared their enjoyment. And I think the way that we can continue to do that currently, I mean, the way that I try to contribute to that, is to talk about sex as openly as possible, to talk about how long it took me to finally have sex because of the way that I was raised. And I've shared that story with many of you at RK many times. To talk about the shame and the guilt of when I finally broke with the taboos that I was raised with, and how much guilt and shame I felt, and how I got rid of that guilt and shame by fucking it out of my system. And then, after I fucked it out of my system, I began to ask, what do I want? What do I want? And what I want now, and it's taken me, a while to talk about it openly and to tell it to everyone in my life, is I am not monogamous. I am polyamorous. I don't believe in monogamy. Now, we talk about monogamy, we talk about polyamory, or not even polygamy for men, right? And how men, Muslim men especially, and men of other cultural backgrounds can have several spouses. Well, guess what? I want that too. I don't think that this is a male-woman thing. And not only do I want it, but I have created it for myself. Because I go around now, and I'm very open about being polyamorous. There is a word now, you know how we talk about heteronormativity? There is mononormativity. Now, heteronormativity and mononormativity, all these big words, are of course the result of evil patriarchy. Because while patriarchy tells men that they have this incredible sex drive, it doesn't talk about our sex drive. I have a sex drive too. And my sex drive does not abide by the rules of mononormativity or patriarchy. So I talk openly now about being polyamorous. I talk openly now about how the older I get, the queerer I get. Because I look around and I think, you know what? All those years ago, I never even had the opportunity to ask who I want to have sex with and who I'm attracted to. Because there was a very narrow social confine. Like, this is who you're attracted to, and this is who you should grow up to want to get married to. And I'm destroying all of that. If we want to talk about fantastical futures, we can't take baby steps towards those futures. We have to destroy the structures that have confined us. And that biggest evil structure for me is patriarchy. So I talk about the joy of sex, the joy of lust, the liberation of queerness, and the liberation of ethical non-monogamy. All these big words, fuck the big words. Call them whatever you want to call them, but call them what you want, because you've taken all this time to get there. And when I talk about sex as well, I talk about it very specifically as a woman of Muslim descent. I talked earlier about how I oppose the veil and I argue with my mother and my sister. But I will tell you, if anyone ever attacks a Muslim woman in a veil in front of me, I will beat the fucking shit out of them. I will, because this is an internal conversation. And at the same time, if anyone is homophobic in front of me or tries to impose the patriarchal norms, I will also beat the fucking shit out of them. And earlier this year, I did beat a man up. I beat a man up for the first time in my life. Earlier this year, in a club. And it had to do with sex, because I was dancing in a club with my beloved, and someone groped my ass. And this was the week that I began Mosque Me Too. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? I've spent the entire week talking about sexual assault in sacred spaces, and I was called, and Muslim men would write to me and say, you're too ugly to be assaulted. And I would say, okay, you know what? I am ugly, but I was still assaulted. And then they would write to me and say, you're a whore. You would never be assaulted. I would say, you know what? I am a whore. I'm not scared of that word. I am a whore. I am a slut. I was still assaulted. So I go dancing to relax, I go to the club, I'm dancing, and this guy actually groped my ass. I was like, you're fucking kidding me. You chose the wrong day and the wrong woman. And I found him, and I tugged at his shirt, and he wasn't expecting this little 5'4" woman to do anything. And he fell on the platform in the middle of the club, and I sat on him. He was 6'2". I sat on him, and I punched and I punched and I punched. And my beloved was there, and he says I punched him about 12 times. And then afterwards, to wrap up my story of sex and bodies and men, the manager of the club actually came up to me and he said, what happened? And I explained. And he actually had the nerve to look at my beloved, who is a man, and turn to me and say, why didn't you let your husband take care of this? So patriarchy wants patriarchy to take care of patriarchy, because when patriarchy protects us, we're nice and safe, but if we disobey patriarchy's rules, oh my God. And I disobey patriarchy's rules intentionally. Yes. So I said to him, you know what? First of all, he's not my husband. Second of all, this is my body. I own this body, not him. Yes. And if someone touches this body without my consent, I'm going to beat the fucking shit out of them. And I did. Yes.
When I told you guys she was a troublemaker, was I lying? Yomi and Elizabeth, I think this question goes out to both of you. So this past week, a lady who is in Nigeria, a lady who is she basically has the highest role in a corporate institution. She's like the first chairperson of a bank, and she had a training, and the training was called "How to Get Your Husband to Support You," basically, and this leads to my question, which is, we often talk about allies, and oftentimes there's always, I would speak for in Nigeria, when there's conversations about women moving forward and what women want, there's always this conversation about how we need allies and how we need male allies. I know you have mentioned allies. My question, or my fear sometimes, is about how not just men center themselves in these kinds of conversations, but even women end up centering men, essentially centering these patriarchal institutions into their own liberation. So I want to know your take on that.
I think honestly, I think it's a real balancing act, and it's not as clear cut as I wish it was, if that makes sense. I mean, it's interesting, that example that you used about the whole, how can your husband support you sort of thing, because it's something that we have like a chapter on dating in our book, which was really, really, really difficult to write because of how much, I guess, when Mona, you're talking about sort of like, you know, the feeling of a kind of like other people utilizing the issues in your own community and kind of using it as a battering rod to kind of say, see, look at them. So one of the things that I guess, I'm not sure how many people know about it here, but in Britain, specifically so interracial dating is like rife in Britain, which is completely fine. But in the black community, specifically in Britain, we date interracially at, I think, like almost double the rate of every other kind of ethnic group. Yep, and white people interracially date the least, unsurprisingly. But quite a few people sort of like, oh, maybe that's because, you know, white people, they're the majority group in terms of population, so maybe that's why they interracially date less. But then when you actually look at the statistics, it's like, despite how small the black population is in Britain, 2%, we interracially date at something like, it's like 50% or something of black people in interracial relationships. And trying to have those conversations in that dating chapter about, like, you know, why that is that because of, you know, like, let's have conversations about anti-blackness, let's have conversations about colorism specifically, shadeism, let's have conversations about the fact that when it comes down to it, is it people seeing that having a white wife as potentially giving them a better, like, social standing. You reach a certain level, and along with a big house and a nice car, a white wife is what will also show that you've sort of made it. And it was really difficult to kind of have these conversations because A, it kind of felt like airing dirty laundry because we knew people that weren't black would read it, but B, it's that kind of thing, as you mentioned, of like centering the conversation on men and what I suppose they want. You know, this panel's about what women want, but then the conversation could very easily veer into being like, what do men want? How do you sort of navigate this world, you know, as a woman that, you know, is dating guys and wants to maintain that, but is also a feminist? Are these two things juxtaposed, like, when they obviously shouldn't be? So I think our kind of approach in terms of, like, when we were writing about, like, dating and writing about men, and I guess, like, writing about just even allies, like, not even in a romantic sense, just generally, just people that weren't black women, was to just always make sure that black women, and specifically black women, were at the core of who we were talking to. Because I think even in terms of the issues, so men come up a lot in our book, and white people come up a lot in our book, and that's because, if we're being frank, they're responsible for a lot of the issues we're talking about. So they're always going to be raised. Like, I feel like it would be really hard for us to write an entire book about the oppression and then empowerment of black women in Britain without talking about men and without talking about white people, because so much of the, like, bullshit, for lack of a better phrase, that we go through is at the hands of those people. But I think what we try to do is, yes, we're speaking about them, but to be perfectly honest, and I think Elizabeth would 100% agree with this, it was never about their needs. It was always about, this is what, so even when we did, like, we rarely actually spoke to like white people, even in terms of the language you used, or men. We'd always talk about like us as black women, so we use the term us quite a lot, and we talk about them as like, you know, people that, yeah, other. It was flipping. It was the flipping of the narrative and sort of being like, this is, you know, when we're reading, like, I talk all the time about the fact that, you know, we've lived this entire life, like, growing up in Britain, where we've read stories where, you know, they're referring to things and we know that they're not talking about us, if that makes sense. So I always make the joke that, you know, like, I'm not white, I'm not male, I'm not a wizard, and yet I read Harry Potter, but people will act as if they can't read a book that says Black Girl Bible, but I'm none of those things, and I still managed to read and enjoy Harry Potter. So we talk, and even the way that, like, J.K. Rowling and stuff, certain things were written, I knew that I wasn't the person she had in mind when she was writing that book, but I still managed. That's what reading's about: empathy, learning about other people's experiences. So we were very confident, for instance, even in terms of the terminology that we use, like there's a lot of slang in there, and a lot of the slang in London is very much informed by, like, the Caribbean, you know, the Caribbean community exactly was the first kind of dominant black group there. So we'd write in slang, and we'd know, like, at the end of the day, a lot of, you know, when we'd write even the word Oyibo, like, in the text, Google it. I'm not going to stand there and write Oyibo in brackets white, or be like Wagwan in brackets hello. Right. You can go on Google. So we were talking to each other, and we're talking to our community. And I think that's the thing. So when we were speaking even about, like, what white people do, there was no mincing of the words. A lot of people felt uncomfortable to see their own behavior, like, written out in that kind of way. But even when we did speak about, you know, colorism, shadism, the way that black men can, let's be frank, like, be with black women, exactly, be complicit in that oppression, we would also speak about the fact that things like shadism, things like colorism were not born in a vacuum. It was a seed planted by white supremacy that then is watered in our own communities. So white people were very much, white readers, men, everybody was very much aware of what not only they were complicit in, but the things that sort of, that some of them had intentionally, like, sort of created. And I think that's, I guess, how we kind of get around the whole, you know, how do you not center white people, men, or just generally oppressors, because I think we were very intentional in just making sure that we were speaking to, it's almost like we wrote it to each other and to black women, and we've always said this is a book for us, by us. It means that, yes, of course, other people's experiences end up being, like, they're relevant because they're relevant to our oppression, but it's never about them, it's about us.
So we're running out of time, and for some questions. Do we have a roving microphone anywhere? Okay, lady in white first, and then black here. So take you from here and two from there.
Hi, Mona. I have a question for you. So I come from a mixed faith family. My father's Muslim and my mother's Christian, and I identify more as a Christian than Muslim. So a lot of the doctrines in Christianity and Islam says God is beyond your own understanding, so you don't always have to agree with what he prescribes for you. And I find with Islam, because I grew up, I actually had, you know, I'd have Arabic lessons, and then my mom would sneak us off to church. And how do you, because with Islam, I find, because I have cousins and siblings, my brother's a Muslim, it's very specific, right, with the hadith, what it says for a woman to be. So I find it interesting and perhaps also challenging that, you know, you certainly don't look like my cousins. They're a lot more conservative. It's how can you be a Muslim woman and not necessarily adhere to the doctrines that are quite specific and prescriptive? So that's my question.
So Mona, do you want to answer quickly? Should we take several questions? Okay, let's take several questions. And let us know who you're directing your question to as well.
Hello. Itenaria. My question is to all three of you. I was having a conversation and a man told me to calm down. Now, I am very outspoken. I can be very passionate. I do not make any apologies for that. And I definitely do not like being told to calm down, especially from a self-acclaimed feminist who is a man. And I told him that, 1, that is rude. 2, you can't tell me to calm down. Who the fuck are you? And 3, more often than not, women are the ones that are told to calm down, because I'm 100% certain that if you were talking to a man, and he got into this argument with me, which had me thinking that all these things are microaggressions that women face every day. The little digs that men just thoughtlessly throw out, and to them it's like normal conversations, and you're trying to explain to them that, no, this is wrong. You should not be saying this to a woman. So I guess my question is this. How do you deal with microaggressions from men who claim to be feminists? And should we even bother? Because sometimes it's just exhausting, especially because they seem to not even get it or want to get it in the first place. Thank you.
I think we should take this 2 first, so that we don't forget the questions. Okay, so go with yours first.
As quickly as I can, because this could be like the stuff for like 5 books, okay? It is really interesting to me that in all religions, the prescriptives and the orthodoxies, and this is what our tradition says, and this is what it's been done from the beginning of time, benefit men and contain women. Every religion on earth does this. I think there are very few exceptions. So my solution to this would be to liberate yourself from all of that and to figure out what you want. Because if religion is supposed to be about justice and equality, which I believe it should not be about justice and equality for men, and it should not be used as a form or as a weapon for men to control women. And this is what religion, I'm looking at Russia, but even in the communist backgrounds in which religion didn't play big roles, you have a certain pattern at play, which is some kind of orthodoxy that is used to benefit men and to control women. And it gets really, really specific about women's bodies. You know, it's like 5 books about women's bodies and 1 paragraph about men's bodies. So I am now 51 years old, and I know, because I have studied and read all of this stuff, just how controlling of women all of these religions are. So I'm at the stage right now where it's like each to their own. If this is what your cousins, but this is the question now. If this is what your female cousins especially want to do, it is not my place to kind of enter their lives and say, stop doing this. Because at the end of the day, you know, as long as they're adults and they're doing this with consent, there's very little I can do about it. But what I can do about it is to just urge them to question everything and look around and ask, are they being contained by the very same things that are benefiting the men around them? And often the answer, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist or a Hindu, is yes, you are. And so if we're going to talk about fantastical futures, it is time for women to destroy all of those things that contain us.
So we have a chapter on microaggressions, and again, it's very much about, I guess we talk very much about misogynoir specifically, so racism and sexism, the specific, combination that affects black women. So a lot of ours is sort of in relation to white people as well as it is to men, and I think it's pretty much the exact same approach, which is that there is no one approach, because microaggressions are so different. Some microaggressions are like macroaggressions, as in literally somebody coming and being like, I want to touch your hair. Somebody saying, oh, you speak very well for, me that was born in South London. Like people be like, oh, you speak very well, as if there's any reason why I wouldn't even have this accent. People asking me where I'm really, really from. They're all different kind of like levels to what a microaggression is, and that's why we don't give a one sort of cookie cutter shape answer to how you respond, because everyone's different. And I think we speak a lot about the fact that anger at times, especially in relation to this kind of treatment, like I can't remember who said it, maybe it was, I can't remember, but someone was talking about the fact that basically racism is just a distraction. It's a distraction from you doing the things that you need to do, especially, that's it, Toni Morrison, thank you. It's a distraction from you doing the things that you need to do, your work, getting on with your life. Like, you're just spending your time explaining yourself to people. So we never try to say that, you know, if somebody says something to you that is disrespectful, it's sexist, it's racist, that, you know, you need to take the time out of your day to be explaining to them why it's sexist and racist, that you can't get angry. We've never once in this book said don't get angry, because anger's it's a natural and healthy emotion. And if that's what you feel and if that's what you want to express to that person and they've earned it, it's completely fair enough. If you perhaps maybe have like a relationship with the person, care about them. I say this, for instance, like with my parents, and some of the, like, you know, when I used to have my afro out, and my mum, who's learnt to love it now, before sometimes would be like, can't you just, do you know what I mean, just pack it so at least it looks like, you know, presentable. Whereas I'd explain, like, you know, this is what my hair is, I just like to wear it like this, like it's whatever. And now she completely, you know, loves it, has time for it. But that was a conversation because I value her as a person, I know she's intelligent, and I know she's just of a different generation. Am I going to be doing that with every rubbish man in a group chat that says that I need to calm down? Absolutely not. If somebody pinches my bum in a club when I'm having a good time, am I going to sit on top of them and beat them up? Maybe. That's the thing. There's different levels to it, and I think that's very much what we say in the book, that it's not one size fit all, because not all microaggressions are the same. It's like the reaction that you probably have towards this man, if it's to cuss him out, it's very much, we talk about all our feelings pretty much, like, unless you're not coming to physically kill someone, it's very much valid, because it's not like you're reacting to it for no reason. That person's put you in that position and is distracting you from what you should really be doing. So it's very much you just taking it on a case-by-case basis, working out if you even value that person to even give them your time of day. Because, you know, we talk in the book saying that nobody wants an unpaid internship as a man whisperer to be sitting there explaining your life to somebody. Do you understand? Like, to somebody that you don't even care about. So if you don't care about them and he's telling you to calm down, just block him. If you do you know what I'm saying? Like, depends on who it is.
We'll take the two. Where's the mic? So both of them, the two women there. Yes, Panache and Arit, very quickly.
Okay, so the first point is just, Mona, I wanted you to just speak to maybe, is it an issue of maybe the Abrahamic religions? Because I'm wondering, with a lot of our traditional spirituality, I mean, someone speaking about Yoruba goddess, I don't know much about it, but speaking about the gender fluidity of the gods, I know in Shona and traditional culture, there's a lot, you can speak to female spirits, or female spirit mediums of male spirits. There's a whole lot more gender fluidity that I think was destroyed through the monotheistic, the Abrahamic side, the Judaism, Islam, Christianity have destroyed a lot of what our religions traditionally have had the space for empowerment of women and women to be leaders, because religion and politics were always very intricately linked. So to destroy that was to destroy a lot of our power. So I wonder if it's not a case of all religions, but specifically about some of these, the Abrahamic traditions being the ones that are more oppressive to women. And the second thing I just want to ask is, I don't know what your thoughts are on the issues around excellence, you know, black excellence, and how coded that is about excellence being inherently not, you know, having kind of anti-black undertones when we speak about excellence, and also just the pressure to slay with that hyper-visibility of black women, just if you've encountered those kind of conversations in response to your book.
And then we'll take the last question.
My question is for you, Mona. We're having more and more instances of women's achievements becoming more visible, and that's showing ways that African feminism was manifested within our local context. So one question, two parts. The first question is, do you feel that there is a danger sometimes when we look at feminism from a global perspective? Do you think there is a danger of erasing the ways that feminism has been manifested in our local context? And then looking forward, do you feel like there is a meeting point as we talk about fantastical futures where we can start to incorporate the various ways that we were feminists before we knew that there was a word for it?
Very quickly to Panache's point about the religions, absolutely. You know, I will usually say, you know, there are some pagan religions like Wiccans or various spiritual religions, but you know, I also want to complicate it by looking at a country like India, where there are lots of goddesses, and they have a long history of, you know, goddess worship of various kinds, and there are incredible amounts of misogyny in India, you know, and I cannot speak to the local traditions in various countries on our continent. So I wouldn't, presume. But even in those various contexts in which, goddesses and gender fluidity exist, there's still a lot of misogyny, which leads me to the conclusion that regardless of Abrahamic religions or pagan religions, I think what has happened now is that patriarchy has just straddled all religions, and even those that do have goddesses. I mean, I have an ancient Egyptian goddess on my arm called Sekhmet, who was the most revered and feared, and look at Egypt now. I mean, we're obviously under an Abrahamic religion, but I just wonder that even in the context where there is goddess worship and there is room for like the spiritual kind of like mother deity, of the amount of misogyny that exists now. But yes, I hear what you're saying about especially gods and goddesses here, or not even like gender specific ones, the ones that contain all the genders. Gender fluidity. And I'm going to leave the Black excellence point to you.
Do you want to go
and
on
very
the
quickly about
feminism?
feminisms. Yes. You make an excellent point, because when I look at my own background as well, I think of people like Nawal Saadawi, the Egyptian veteran feminist, Fatima Mernissi, who was a Moroccan feminist. There are so many books and so many feminist initiatives coming from South Africa. I recently got a copy of the Feminism Is book from South Africa, and I think that all of those various manifestations and iterations of feminisms, plural, are important in their local context. And I think the reason that I try to get a more global perspective is because I travel a lot among all of these spaces, and I try to connect what is in common with all of them. And obviously the thing that is in common is that we're fighting patriarchy. We fight it in various ways, in different ways, and for me the most important way that we fight it is that we fight it as women of color. Because I'm not invested in having this argument. Esther Amar was here last year when we had the F word, and she said something beautiful. She said to me, white feminism treats feminism as an argument between a husband and wife. And when that argument over misogyny is over between the two of them, it's finished. Whereas for us, in other contexts that are not, it's not about just misogyny. It's about racism, it's about apartheid, it's about capitalism, it's about ableism, it's about being genderqueer, it's about so many things. So I think that everyone, and also I wouldn't presume to speak for your context or other people's contexts. What I can speak about is the way that I travel between all those places and what I've learned about them, and that ultimately, for that future, is to destroy patriarchy through our collective energies.
So Black excellence, very quickly.
I think my problem, I love Black excellence. I think it's great. We talk about it in a book. I think that's why we're celebrating the women that we've chosen to approach. I think the problem with Black excellence is when it's modelled on white men and white women, it's things I will never be. So I think it's important to kind of define your expectations and who you want to be external to the expectations of white people, your parents and all of that sort of stuff. So I think for us, the pressure to slay is even more so over the last couple of months while the book has come out, and there's so much expectations when people meet you and everything like that. But I think it's important to be authentic to yourself and authentic to who you want to be, and that's a journey. And it's not like it's a what do you call it? It's a marathon, not a sprint by any means. But yeah, it's a good question.
Sorry, I just need to add as well. Someone said to us the other day that like we essentially want to live in a world where Black women can be as mediocre as white men. And get the same rewards for it. And I think that's another sort of conversation we have about Black excellence. Like me and Elizabeth have really had to, put our heads together, make essentially not perfect, but almost perfect book for it to be able to get the acclaim it has. And you really just see like a white man with like double the experience, half the energy, and just walk it. And I think that's the thing about Black excellence, that why do we sometimes even have to be excellent? Because they're people that we're walking into rooms with that are certainly not excellent, they're mediocre. And when Black women have the freedom to be as mediocre as many white men are, then we'll know that we've really achieved true equality.
Very quickly, to finish my point to you about the feminisms as well, I think that it's really important for us in this hall and in this festival to recognize feminists in Uganda like Stella Niazi and others who had that march for women's lives, the Southern African feminists who also had that march for all identities against violence against women. And there are so many initiatives across the continent that I think are really important to recognize, because I think African feminism especially, someone yesterday was talking, Malara Wood said, Africa's not ossified, and I think African feminism is also not ossified. It's past, present, and future.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to our panelists. Mona, Yomi, and Elizabeth. So please go out there and smash the patriarchy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Wana. Please give these guys an incredible round of applause. Shatter the patriarchy.